In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الذي لا إله سواه والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. رب زدنا علما ولا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. I was informed of the topic. I am to share a few thoughts with you about it. Namely, does God exist? I have never talked about something like that. It never occurred to my mind, the question, does God exist? And above all, I am to share with you thoughts about that in 15 to 20 minutes. Let me see what I can do, inshallah ta'ala, within these few minutes, of which I shall perhaps speak of different aspects of the way I feel about the question. Does God exist for me brings the question to me experientially. Does life exist? We see the consequences of life. Life as a concept is not something you see with your eyes or you hear with your ears. There are consequences of life. There are manifestations of life. There are indications of life. Does life exist? Does love exist? Does love exist? I can't see love. I can't touch love. I can't hear love. Does love exist? And note that both life and love are creations of the divine. The divine God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the source of life, is the source of love. Does God exist raises the question in me experientially, does will exist? Does irada exist? Does will exist? These, as you know, are questions almost spontaneously answered in your fitrah, by your innate quality as a creature, as a human being. You know innately, spontaneously, naturally the answer. Though you have not seen love, you have not touched life, you have not heard will, and they do exist. And we know they exist in a sense that is more sure than perhaps I know that the Virgin Islands exist. I've never been there. Those of us who have never been there, been to the Virgin Islands, know the Virgin Islands exist. And you've never been there. I know love is and life is and will is without having ever seen or touched, but have experienced them and have seen and heard the consequences, the indicators of those. The concept of al-fitrah in a human being, as you know, that innate quality is what spontaneously, most innocently answers the question, does God exist? Therefore, there are those, by the way, there are those who reached a spiritual status of certitude and of knowledge and of wisdom, for whom the question is not whether God exists or not. Their question is, do I exist? Their question is, do I exist? Of course, in a form that is different than the question of, do I exist in a physical sense? Do I have an independent existence after they, in their hearts and souls and minds and spirits, God is definitive. They are less sure of their existence in space and time than the existence of the divine. The ayat, the signs of the divine in his creation, the external evidence, the evidence that is there for us to mount a proof of God's existence. When you look at the heavens, at the earth, at space, when you conceive of time, when you look at a smile of a child, at a petal of a rose, at the flow of a stream of water, at the chirping of birds, at the rustling of leaves of a tree, those for you, for us, are definitive indicators of the existence of a designer. When you see in this universe, in this creation, design everywhere, perfection in design everywhere, orderliness, complexity in orderliness, all of those, and each one of those concepts is to be observed in every bit of creation. And the number of creation is not a million or a billion. There are trillions upon trillions of living things. Each one of them carries in it to you signs, at least of plausibility argument, signs of a designer, of a maker. It is just impossible to think otherwise. As you all know, if you find a watch in a desert, there's got to be a watchmaker and not a blind watchmaker, if you know what I mean, those of you who read the work. It's not a blind watchmaker. A blind person cannot make a complex watch, a functional, complex watch. It's impossible. The signs inside of me and you about who you are, what you are, the signs inside of you and me are abundant about the impossibility that I have come into this world without a maker, without a designer, without a creator, without an intelligent cause and source. It's simply impossible. Just like it is impossible to observe a Boeing 747-400, and you would say that this simply came out of the compilation, the random compilation of iron and steel and wires, and leave them by themselves for 1 billion years, and they will make a Boeing. They become a Boeing 747-400 in its complexity and in its function and its operations. It's impossible. Everything in the creation is like that. Simply a proof that it is impossible for the non-existence of a maker. It is simply impossible. The puzzle of perfection in creation is impossible to answer except by the existence of a maker, of a designer. My dear brothers and sisters, the probabilities, when you look at the probabilities in terms of mathematics and in terms of science, that a living organism, nay, not a living organism, a very simple component of a living organism could have come by random chance, is impossible mathematically, is impossible logically. So do the mathematicians and so do the statisticians in molecular biology say, for example, to have simple functional protein, a very small single functional protein, to come and to form by chance, even in the existence of the so-called biological soup that existed billions of years ago. Even with that, the probabilities for a functional protein to form, for amino acids to connect and to combine in the way they ought to be to make, I repeat, a functional protein, not just a protein or proteinuoid or proteinoid rather, the probability is staggeringly small. Some have computed that probability to be something like 10 to the power minus 950, 10 to the power minus 950. 1 divided by 10 to the power 950. You can't imagine what that is of a number. If only you know that the number of particles, of all particles in the universe, is how much? How much? Anybody knows? Just to compare 10 to the 950. All the particles in the universe in space-time that we know of, the visible universe, are no more than something like of the order of 10 to the power 78. And a living cell is not simply a protein. A living cell is an integrated activity, complex, ordered, adaptive, controlled, purposeful activities of hundreds of thousands of enzymes and proteins together. Every movement, every motionlessness is programmed, is information. Hoyle, Professor Hoyle and another a great physicist and mathematician, computed an approximation, the approximate probability of having a cell with integrated enzymes, only 2,000 enzymes, to come together randomly. The probability of that, they computed, is 10 to the power minus 40,000. That's simply, it's an impossibility. Even if you leave all the soup, the biological soup there, for 10 times longer than the age of the universe than we know. Just doesn't make sense. That orderliness, that beauty, that perfection does not come simply by itself. The second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics refuses that living cells, that living organisms came by chance without a creator. It's impossible. You know why? I remind you of some basic things you learned in thermodynamics in your physics. Sometimes we learn physics, but we learn the equations and we don't know what they mean actually. And that's terrible. Sometimes you have scientists, you have doctors in physics and in biochemistry or biology who don't know what the equations really mean at the reality in life, at the level of reality in life. The second law of thermodynamics says simply this: in nature, in a closed system, there can never be order born out of disorder from within the system. Work has to be done from outside of the system to do order. In other words, if you leave something orderless, and you leave it even all trillions of years you want, it will never be orderly. It will only increase in disorder. And that's the second law of thermodynamics, the law of the universe, the most important law that governs the universe. That means life, which is organized and ordered, cannot come out of something not ordered, i.e. something inorganic, bringing forth something living when it had a degree of less order and less complexity. It cannot increase in orderliness and in complexity left alone by chance. It's impossible. Therefore, life cannot come out of lifelessness. It's impossible. Now, Earth is a system open to the galaxies. But the galaxies, and they form the universe, and the entire universe, and all the universes are a closed system in themselves. Life in the universe could not have arisen from within the universe without an external life, introducing order, life, into the universe. That's a simple interpretation of the second law of thermodynamics. It's impossible. Science, as Einstein said, can never refute the existence of God. Science can never refute the existence of God. I'll tell you why. Because by the definition of science, as science is defined, and perhaps we need to redefine what science means and ought to be, science defines something is scientific if it explains phenomenon in the physical realm, in nature. And number two, if it also explains things yet unseen, it explains them within the laws of nature. Thirdly, a scientific theory is falsifiable, meaning what? That if something is claimed to be scientific, we ought to do an experiment that is repeated about the same thing and shows the same thing. If it does not, then it is false. In other words, we have the chance to falsify a theory, to prove that it is false, only if it is repeatable. If it is not repeatable, it is outside the realm of science. Now, the origin of life, is it repeatable? The answer is no. It's an event that took place whenever it took place, and it does not repeat itself. So it is not subject to science. Science is operational. It deals with operations in the universe. It does not deal with origin. Do you understand? Because origin cannot be repeated to be proven false or true. So it is not scientific. So scientists mingling with origin and saying there can be no creator because we are unable to include creator within the laws of physics that we know them is, I think, unintelligent to do and to say. Life, as one of them said, never arises except from life. So far as actual evidence goes, this is still the only possible conclusion. But since it is a conclusion that seems to lend back to some supernatural creative act, it is a conclusion that scientific man find very difficult of acceptance, said J.W.N. Sullivan, considered to be one of the 4 or 5 most brilliant interpreters of physics to the world of the common man. Because scientists are unable to integrate the concept of a creator outside of the realm of creation within the scientific definition, they don't accept it. They don't accept it meaning as part of science as defined, not necessarily as not existing, when we cannot prove the existence of something that is not proof of its non-existence. It's that simple. Molecular biologist Michael Denton said, to grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it becomes like a giant spaceship with a diameter of 20 kilometers, as big as London or New York. And then you could see what a living cell is. He said, what we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. On the surface of the cell, we would see millions of openings, like the portholes of a vast spaceship, opening and closing to allow a continual stream of materials to flow in and out. If we were to enter one of these openings, we would find ourselves in a world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. We would wonder at the level of control implicit in the movement of so many objects down to seemingly endless conduits, flowing down to seemingly endless conduits, all in perfect unison. A living cell is not just a conglomerate of proteins and enzymes and particles. It is orderly, it is controlled, it is adaptive, it is functional, it is purposeful. Every motion is programmed beforehand, my dear brothers and sisters. Darwin himself, after writing on the origin of species a few years later, wrote privately to one of his friends in the United States, and he said he admits privately of doubts over the capacity of natural selection to generate very complicated adaptations or, quote, organs of extreme perfection. He says somewhere else, the eye to this day gives me a cold shudder. In other words, he's saying, my concept of natural selection, it fails when it looks at something so perfect and so functional as the eye. It gives me a cold shudder. It is too perfect, too beautiful to be the invention of natural selection through random processes. My dear sisters and brothers, the Quran comes and God reveals himself to the world, and God spoke to the world, and God spoke to the prophets and to the messengers of God, and God made himself manifest through the eyes of the hearts of some man, prophets and messengers of God, and some awliya and some saints. He made himself manifest through his attributes and names, to the extent that they, with the eyes of their hearts, saw the divine and the miracles that the prophets came with to be evidence for them of the truth of the message from the divine. And the Quran is replete with texts that challenge humanity about the existence of God, that God exists, that God spoke to the world, and the evidence, the plausible evidence, the compilation of so many parts and parcels of evidence in the Quran are there to make the person reach the level of no doubt that he exists. And I close with this. One of the Bedouins in the time of early Arabia, Bedouin, simple Bedouin, he said about the existence of God and the existence of the Creator, he said, البعرة تدل على البعير والأثر أو القدم يدل على المسير أرض ذات أفجاج وسماء ذات أبراج ألا تدل على العليم القدير. He said, البعرة, discharge of an animal, بعرة, is evidence that the sheep or the goat or the camel passed by here. Al-Qadamu, the footprint, is evidence that someone walked here, a human or an animal. He says, an earth filled with springs and a sky filled with lanterns, don't those lead to the fact of the existence of a Alim, an all-knowing and an all-powerful? Those are messages. He said that 14 centuries ago. I think nowadays we can say the following: an intelligible communication via radio signal from some distant galaxy would be widely hailed as evidence of an intelligent source, isn't it? That's what they're waiting for. Shouldn't we say Doesn't the message, that's a message, doesn't the message sequence on the DNA molecule also constitute, therefore, evidence for Alimun Qadir? Subhanallah. If a message from outer galaxies constitute evidence of an intelligent source, the message embedded in you and me and in every living cell in the DNA information. It's information. It's not simply a collection of molecules. It's information. It's messages upon messages and trillions of messages. Doesn't there indicate evidence of an all-knowing and an all-powerful? Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.